So we'll start with the WCAC because they comprise almost 50% of the list. Let's start with someone who we had on the bubble, Terrence Williams. Who wants to go first?
So I think I had him on my list that we did a couple of weeks ago. Gonzaga had a really strong year. I think it came down to Keels, and Leggett, and one was going to get left off. I agree with having Terrence on there. While he had a great career, I don't really think that matters all that much for this because it's this year's resume and how it stacks up. And I would have had him on my team, so I'm good. I'm good with him being on their team.
So would you have had him before the state championship? Did you have him before that, or do you think that makes a difference?
To be honest, like I didn't do this like every so often. I mean, I just did it at the end of I did it when we did it all together a couple of weeks ago. I think that certainly solidifies himself. I mean, look, a guy like Leggett loses 2 games before that and doesn't have the opportunity to play in 2 really meaningful games, and Williams does and does well in the playoffs, and they win the championship. So I certainly think that has some bearing.
All right, got it. Mr. Dickerson?
Well, as you know, I had him on my original list. I actually had him at the top of my list. In addition to having, I thought a great senior campaign. He's really had a great career, and so I thought it was a great culmination this year. Maybe Gonzaga is a little disappointed in terms of what happened, with them, at the end of the season. But Terrence played great. He did a lot of things for them. He rebounded the ball. He scored the ball. He shoots the cover off the ball. No arguments whatsoever. He was at the top of my list for first team All-Met.
Another thing I want to mention that we didn't really mention on the last pod was if you're an All-Met one year like Terrence was last year, I feel like you got to really regress if you don't get it the following year.
Right.
I feel like it kind of gives you a leg up going into the following year, and I just wanted to mention that.
Well, you think it still gives them a leg up despite having the majority of the players from last year's list and the majority of players from this year's list from the same conference? When you say he would have to regress, you're talking about production-wise, or are you talking about their team's overall success?
I just think it gives you a leg up when you get it one year, going into that next year, you're kind of there, and it's your spot to lose.
Exactly. Yeah, I'd agree with that. And as I told you, G, I got a ton of phone calls after the texts, DMs after our last gathering here, and one of the calls I got was from a Terrence Williams supporter who really threw some facts and figures at me and stats, and and warranted in his particular case, he was warranting a Player of the Year bid for Terrence. So, and the numbers back it up, but as you know, that doesn't always have anything to do with it. So,
got it. So Terrence Williams, both of you guys agree with that. I just have a quick question: does Ish Leggett have any chance of winning the Gatorade Player of the Year, or does Terrence Williams walk away with that as well?
I think Terrence did already, didn't he?
No, it comes out. It will be released in 3 days, I think, from this recording.
Okay, well, listen to what I'm saying to you. I think Terrence did already. That's what my resources say, but I may be wrong.
Okay. Well, last year Casey won it, and Terrence's numbers, there was people kind of believe that he probably should have won it last year, and Casey won it last year from DC. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there. Could the same thing possibly happen again? But from what you're saying, I guess his numbers and then also his winning will take him over.
That's what I have. What I have so far now.
Got it. No problem.
don't necessarily.
So
I'll go on the record, but I've heard otherwise. So.
All right, so let's move on. Let's move on to Earl Timberlake.
I think that was a unanimous kind of no-brainer.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Dickerson?
Same with me. No brainer. Fantastic season. DeMatha pulling off the WCAC championship for me was really a big deal, and I spoke about it earlier because I just didn't at the beginning of the season. They didn't look like they'd be able to do that, and I think Earl really led the charge this year, and was really responsible for DeMatha having such a successful season.
Got it. I agree with Earl being on the first team as well, but I'm going to put an asterisk by his name because I want to come back and make a point about him when we kind of go further along in the recording. So let's move on to Trevor Keels.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't pick Trevor initially when we did.
Well, and
I know you're probably still in it.
And Marc, and if you remember, Marc and I jumped all over you,
right?
Because of that. In fact, I think I said something along the lines of, would LeBron make your first team All-Met team? Right. Trevor had a unbelievable season. He made. I think he made some shots for the ages this year, and I think that Marc would agree. There were a couple performances that he had that just put him in another category, and really made him. He had been a very strong. What I call a regional recruit. So, all the top mid-Atlantic schools, it kind of offered him. But I think once he had some of those performances, particularly over at DeMatha in Keith's tournament, that put him on a national stage. I got calls about him from Pac-12 schools, asking, "Hey, what's the story on this kid? We just saw him, just light this gym up." So I'm Trevor Keels all the way, first teamer, no doubts.
Got it. And Stern, I'm sure you have the same, right?
Yeah. For sure. I mean, I had him before. The only thing he's done since then is win the Virginia State chip and look pretty good doing it. So I definitely have him on mine.
Yeah, I in this situation, I kind of agree with you two in the sense that I don't think that Virginia State championship really mattered. I think, like you said, he was on there last year. That certainly helped him again this year. I also think that something that you mentioned just now, Mr. Dickinson, his performances in the National Hoop Fest and also on the national stage, his increased, not his increased, but his recruiting kind of really blowing up where he kind of started to receive interest and offers from blue bloods. I think that kind of played into this a little bit as well. And then also, like you said, his production, even though it was very close to Jeremy's, I think that he was probably the more consistent of the two in playing this season, especially locally.
Well, yeah, and so
those are my thoughts.
The thing is, he just knows how to play, and once he started executing at a very high level, night after night. I mean, he last year, as a sophomore, he had some real highlight games. But, pretty much every night, Trevor bought that thing this year. And so I think that and, the USA experience, I think, increased his confidence, knowing that he could play at that high level. So he was just zoned in a lot. And, the other thing is, and then we'll jump on to the next player. But I told you that I felt that it would be, we would be looking at, 50 to 60% of this first team all met would be, WCAC kids.
Right. You did. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about Jeremy Roach now. So Trevor makes the list, and we also have his teammate Jeremy Roach. Since we've had our last conversation, they've won Visa. I know you guys probably don't think that Visa had anything to do with them making either one of them making this list. They would have been here regardless. Yep. But what are your thoughts on Jeremy Roach being first team all Met as well?
I mean, I had him on my initial list. I think he had a really, really solid senior year. It was impressive the way he bounced back off a big injury, and it was just really impressive to see him produce at this clip, given the fact that he wasn't probably at 100%, especially at the beginning of the year. And it's a little unusual to have two kids from the same team that didn't win their ultimate prize, but I think in this case, it was just warranted the way those two kids played. I mean, they had phenomenal seasons, and I mean, between the two of them, they pretty much account for all of PVI's success. I mean, they had some other guys, but especially, with JoJo Free leaving, I mean, these two had even more responsibility to carry.
Got it. And Mr. Dickerson?
Well, I mean, I just thought he was a first teamer off the rip. And really right at the beginning of the season when they started their first 3 or 4 games, I mean, they were the one team that really looked like they had probably played about 15 games. They really looked good. In fact, I remember calling Glenn Farello and saying, "Hey, look, man, I don't know what you have done, but these guys look like they're already in mid-season form. They were playing better than anybody in terms of as a team." And great career, great leadership by Jeremy coming off the ACL. Looked really good early and got better. Got better. I think what we hadn't seen from him prior to this senior year, I had not seen Jeremy finish at the rim and the way that he did. This season. Jeremy was not necessarily a jump shooter this year. I mean, Jeremy took the ball to the rack. I mean, he added another level. I mean, he was finishing, with his left hand. He was finishing in traffic. He was finishing with contact. I think he just played great. He showed me another level of athleticism that I don't think I really, saw to this full degree until his senior year.
Got it. And I had him initially on my list. I only had 3 players. I had Earl, Hunter, and Jeremy from the WCAC when we initially did this. But his game against Gonzaga, I already had him, but his game against Gonzaga in the playoffs really just took me over as far as convincing me. Because, like I said before, their stats were similar to me, and I kind of think that performance to me kind of sealed it. But let's move on to the next player from the WCAC, which will be Hunter Dickinson from DeMatha. Who wants to go first?
I mean, I think like all the guys, the majority of the guys we mentioned have been pretty kind of no-brainers. This guy is definitely another no-brainer. WCAC Player of the Year. Had a 40-point game against St. John's. Tremendous year, and I think won fairly close to a unanimous vote in WCAC Player of the Year. Maybe 1 or 2 votes he didn't garner, but
I think it was 2 that he didn't get.
Yeah, so I think he's pretty no-brainer.
Does anyone know what the other 2 went?
I'm pretty sure
Terrence and Roach.
I'm pretty sure Mike Jones is not allowed to vote for him, so that's 1.
Right.
And there was 1 more, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay. But Mr. Dickinson, did you want to chime in on Hunter?
Just a great second half of the season in particular. I think he started off slow. You know, Hunter has had over the 4-year stretch. You know, Hunter kind of grew as much as anybody and not in just the WCAC, but in the area. And I think when you're a big kid like that, who's, you know, relatively young, you don't know your body's limits, or you don't even know when you're hurt. And so, you know, Hunter had a lot of bumps and bruises, and a lot of it just growing pains over the years. But I saw him improve in so many areas. And I think this year, what made this year special for him is that we saw leadership, and Marc, I think you probably agree, we saw leadership qualities from him, particularly the second half of the year. I mean, there were a couple of times when he just, you know, refused to let DeMatha lose, you know, and they were in tough games. And Hunter has a really Hunter's got a little chip there and a little edge to him, which I love, that makes him competitive. And so he was great, man. He was lights out this year. This was an all-Met year for him, absolutely no question.
One thing to piggyback off what you just said, Dave, that chip and that competitiveness, you know, I think that rubs some people the wrong way. He kind of has some exploits on the court that some people may not be in favor of.
Are you talking about the WCAC championship?
I mean, that's part of it, but what he did in the WCAC championship, he did, you know, a fair amount during other games.
Right.
And you know, like I personally, you know, I guess I would prefer not to see it. It doesn't really, I don't think it's too egregious. Some people think it is kind of egregious. There's a lot of chatter about kind of his exploits, but I think in this day and age, there's a lot of trash talking. There's a lot of it comes with the territory. Yeah. It is what it is. Everyone doesn't do it, but I don't see it as big of an issue.
I'll take it from Hunter, and I'm gonna tell you why. Because you know, if you've watched him closely the way that I have, over the last, not even the last 4 years, but over the last 6 or 7 years from middle school, you know, he took a lot of you know, WCAC crowds, you know, the in particular the PVIs and the Gonzagas are tough places to play, and the kids go after him, and you know, you get the overrated chants, and you know, he sucks and all that kind of stuff. And Hunter used a lot of that for motivation. I know I can remember his junior season last year over at PVI. I mean, the kids just really went out after him right from the break, you know. And so Hunter responded by hitting 2 deep threes.
Doesn't every player's best team get chance like that and get? I mean, that's kind of a rite of passage if you're a good player. People are
exactly, and so because of that, you know, I like I said, I'll take Hunter in that edge any day, you know. As a coach, you know, that's what you want to see, you know. Hunter is not you know, he's not going to probably ever be a real smooth gazelle type of athlete. You know, he's going to have to be a somewhat of a grinder, you know, at the next level, you know, because of some of the athleticism he'll be facing. So I'll take the toughness from him any day.
Got it. For me, I kind of look at him in his matchups locally against players similar in size. So in those games that he played against players 6'10" or taller, he had really great performances. To me, that more so dictates his dominance, well, not necessarily his dominance, but his overall performances this season to me than anything else locally. And then also we saw what he did on the national stage against Evan Mobley. I kind of grade him differently than anybody else because we are such a guard-oriented area. When he matches up with the big from McNamara, when he matches up with the Andre Green, he matches up with There's one more I'm probably forgetting.
Carroll.
Yeah, Tegra from Carroll. When he matches up with those players, how does he perform? That's what solidifies him to me as definitely a first teamer.
And that was a learning. It was a good point about Evan Mobley, for example, because he had the learning curve out in Vegas. I was out in Vegas when after his junior year, they played Mobley. The takeover group played Compton Magic, and he didn't fare as well then because there was refereeing differences and stuff like that. But the fouls. So I think he's learned from those things. So I'm on board as an unabashed Hunter Dickinson fan. So
yes, I mean, so I'm in the same boat. I think Hunter had a great career, a great senior year. He battled a lot of injuries early in his career. He didn't really seem to have any injuries this year. He's a damn good player, and he started off the year slow and really, really bounced back when it seemed like he was facing a little bit of adversity. He has a perimeter game that not many guys his size have. So he had a phenomenal year.
Got it. All right, let's move on. We're stepping outside of the WCAC, and we have Benny Williams from St. Andrews in the MAC conference. I had Benny initially, and I think Mr. Dickerson had him as well. Mr. Dickerson, did you want to go first?
No, I mean, I think I don't know if I gave full disclosure on in our first meeting, but Benny is a kid that I had in my program since he was 3 years old. So he literally used to I used to bring him from daycare to the gym with me. Same daycare with my daughter. I grew up playing against his dad, so I've got history with him. I've seen his growth over the years. Benny is really stretched out. I knew he would be big. His sister is about 6'2", and she was a Division I college player as well. Dad is about 6'7", 6'8". But Benny early on, Benny hadn't shown that growth, that fast growth rate that we've seen from him in the last couple of years, and so Benny was a guard. More of the combo variety. So now that he's stretched out to 6'7", and maybe even a little taller than that right now, he's been able to really bring all those skills to the forefront. I thought he had a great season. Had some injuries to the team, and so he had to really pick it up this year. Tremendous, great year this year, but just tremendous upside. I think he's going to get better and better.
Yeah, I had Benny on my list last time also, and I kind of agree with you. I think his best basketball is absolutely ahead of him. I think he may have another level next year going into his senior year, but then in college, I think he'll even blossom even more, especially if he picks the right school. Stern, did you want to chime in?
I agree with what you just said 100%. I mean, I think anyone would agree with that his best basketball is in front of him. I mean, he's got the length, he's got the size, which are, very, very important components of, next level basketball.
And by the way, that body's going to fill out too, Marc, because, based on his family members. So right now he's thin. I mean, he's straight up and down, but, in a year or two, it's going to be a wrap.
Yeah, and his athleticism is pretty good too.
Yes,
with that size. Yeah. Well, go ahead,
so I only saw St. Andrews play, I believe, one time this year. I mean, I saw tons of highlights. I kept track of kind of he and St. Andrews seasons, as we all kind of do with teams we don't see a lot. Based on the one game that I had seen him play, I thought Colin played better than him. I had kind of been hearing that Colin was having a better year, but then Colin missed a bunch of time. And St. Andrews had a great year, and quite often when there's no player outside of the champion that had an incredible year, you'll give the best player from the team that wins the championship in these prestigious leagues like the MAC, an all-Met player, or an all-Met, the all-Met recognition. I mean, I did not have him on my first team the last time, we did it. I can certainly understand why. I certainly think he's got a really, really promising future. I would, so for me, and I'm going to get into this a little bit later, I don't think selections should have been made already. There's so much basketball that's left to play. There's really important games that are left to play. There's kids on Wise. There's kids on St.CHARLES that might be, deserving of first team All-Meds. For me, Benny is right on the bubble. And I could, maybe for me, one of those kids passes Benny on the list.
Based upon postseason play.
Based upon their whole body of work, and winning a championship is a major part of their whole body of work.
Yeah, except for you also have to understand, Marc, it's really kind of based on sort of the regular season and where they are. Normally, the season is over now.
No, it's not.
For 85%, 90% of the high school, the season is over.
Every year the Maryland State Championships are the same year. Every year.
I know, but it doesn't really affect what happens during the course of the year as much as we might like to think it would in terms of selection. I mean, and if you look at any other selection scenario, whether you're talking about the college level, ACC, Big Ten, those announcements, those determinations are made based off of the regular season.
I adamantly disagree. I think, yes, those selections are made then, but those selections are recognized as being regular season awards. These selections, like you guys talked about Terrence winning the DC State Championship. You talked about Earl winning the WCAC Championship. So why wouldn't Max Brooks's Maryland 4A or Maryland 3?
Well, count? I know that I've only mentioned it in terms of a body of work because you also heard me talk about, and particularly last time we talked about we talked about improvement and where guys are and what they meant to their teams. And sometimes, guess what? Great players don't win. The people who have great seasons are not necessarily going to win all the chips.
Agree. And I'm not saying all 10 of my All-Met guys need to be champions. I mean, a Ronald Polite, a Corey Dyches, like I have them on my list 100%, and they didn't win championships. But they're winners though, Marc. they played in a winning program. They are winners. They are difference makers. They didn't all get the chips, but these kids are winners, and that's why I have them on my team because of what you just said. But I think you need to compare every kid's resume at the end of the year, and if a kid it's possible that Trey averages 35 points a game in his 2 games at Xfinity, and you parlay that with his 4A PG County Player of the Year resume, and you look at his whole body of work, and he's nowhere to be seen. And this is my biggest grievance with this. In most years, the voting is done after the state championships, so there's no consistency on the publication who does these picks that we're talking about. There isn't consistency on their part in terms of, so 20 years from now, we're going to look back at these lists and we're going to see all these guys who have won and all these decorated champions who have won. And then there's going to be certain years where these guys aren't on there because of when the voting takes place. And I don't agree.
Can I say something? I think it's, excuse me, Mr. Dickinson, let me say something. I think it's odd that your battle is more so about waiting until everything is done than opposed to having one conference having almost 50% of the list. I think that's a very strange argument to have. I mean, you have one conference has 5 players, but you want the Washington Post to wait until the season is completely over for the entire area so they still can pick 5 players from the same conference. That to me just is a very strange argument. Well, yes, it does, because all the players that you're mentioning who are still playing now could be a consideration for the list. We have the list, and traditionally, we have at least 5 players coming from one conference within the last decade,
what's the
for sure.
correlation between waiting to fill in the other 5 players, or and I'm not saying the other 5, I'm saying 1 or 2.
They are. If traditionally you're going to have 5 players come from one conference, what does it really matter? You're only giving the rest of the area another 5 players to pick from.
Well, I think we're I think we're probably in each of you guys has a point. But let's not forget while this has to do with a comparison to that, to our beloved, what the beloved Washington Post is doing. The reality is, and I told you this from the beginning, G, it should really be about this list. This is the all Met list, and we got 10 guys. 10 guys that we're making a determination on as of the date that we're making a determination of. And guess what? We're going to miss on a couple guys, and there's always going to be some guys that are either on the bubble or had great seasons and maybe not recognized to a certain degree. But that's why we're doing this. So we can talk
right.
So we can talk about these guys. And guess what? Let's forget about other than the comparison, to the Post. Let's just forget about that. Let's focus in on our 10 guys.
And I'm not saying that I think these guys should win if they win a state championship. I'm saying they have potentially two more really big games to play on a bright stage. So the championship part maybe is a little part of it, but they have someone could score 60 points in a game at Xfinity, and that wouldn't be on their senior season resume. I mean, it's very unlikely, but it's possible. And
I agree with you on that. But my concern is this. So Trey Thomas won Player of the Year in PG County for his particular conference, right? But he goes to Xfinity. He's still playing. He goes to Xfinity. He has these 2 30-point games that you say he may have. And then we wait till the end of the season. We still have 5 from the WCAC, and Trey Thomas is honorable mention. So that's my problem with the whole thing. Once the WCAC is done, now we pretty much figure where half of the list is coming from. Trey Thomas goes all the way through Xfinity, wins a championship, averages 30 plus, was Player of the Year in his conference in PG County, and he's honorable mention. He doesn't make second, third, or fourth.
I'm saying the voting needs to wait, because you need to see that, and then Trey Thomas could potentially make a first or second team. What you're saying is exactly what I'm saying.
Okay.
Regardless as to whether the WCAC gets 4, 5, 6, or 7, there's still 3, 4, 5, or 6 other spots, and I want to make sure that Trey gets one of those spots if he deserves it. Whether one spot,
it's just really for me. It's about a top 10, and it's not really so much about leagues. It's it's trying to give this thing to put our together our what we think is our best 10 at that particular junction. And for most people, for 90% of the scenarios, the season's over. So this is.
But I just make my last point about this or whatever. So going back to the WCAC, in any other year, I probably wouldn't have as much issue. But now we have 4 players, 2 from 2 different teams, a winner and a loser. So to me, and then we have another player who he did win a state championship, but he also was on a losing team within that conference as well. So now, in just this scenario that we mentioned about Trey Thomas, are you telling me that 3 of those players can't be removed possibly for him if he goes all the way through Xfinity, averages 30, and was Player of the Year in his conference? To me, that logically in basketball logically.
Well, when you're putting teams together and when people are getting recognition and stuff, it's not always about logic and what you think might be happening. It doesn't work like that all the time.
Right. We'll leave it at that. All right. So let's move on. We kind of got sidetracked a little bit. We were speaking on Benny Williams. I kind of want to go back also, but one thing you mentioned, Mark, Colin did have an injury and he kind of missed some games, but both of those players were all conference in the match. So it wasn't like they just picked Ben. Well, the Washington Post selected Benny or we selected Benny. He also was an all-conference performer along with Collins. So I just want to kind of follow up on that. Let's move on to Avery Ford.
So I think this was the one
first?
where a lot of people were kind of scratching their heads. Avery Ford definitely has this pedigree coming from Paul VI, coming from TakeOver. I hadn't heard a ton about Avery Ford this year. I was surprised. The people who I spoke to were kind of surprised. Another player from North Virginia, Landon Hawes, I had kind of been hearing his name as the most likely Virginia Public kid to make it if a Virginia Public kid made it. So I've been trying to do a little digging on Avery Ford's stats this year, and I haven't been able to find much. The All-Met.
Well, they 13 and 10 in the regular season, from my understanding. 13 points, 10 rebounds, a double-double, and maybe a few blocks as well. But I think this goes back to you had a conspiracy theory in the first one where you said normally there's a kid from a Virginia public school to make it. I think you were the one who kind of made that point. So I think he fits that, right?
Well, being that he's a Virginia public, he does. But then the question is he the best candidate of Virginia publics? So it's twofold. Does Virginia publics deserve a player? Should it be him? And I don't know the answer to those questions. I was just kind of surprised.
Right.
I mean, while 13 and 10 are good numbers, are those first team All-Met numbers?
Yeah.
For Virginia public school player,
All-Met kid averaged 13 points a game. I'm sure it's happened, but not much.
Well,
yeah, I mean, you'd have to go back to
Wainwright.
Maybe, I don't know, or less than that would be, somebody like Victor Oladipo, but you're, talking a whole nother different level of athlete.
Ishmael Wainwright averaged less than 10 points. He averaged like 9 points. He almost averaged a triple-double.
But he also averaged, like you said, he had the crazy other numbers. So, yes, it happens occasionally, but not. I mean, how many did Benny average this year?
He
averaged, regular season, he was close to a double. I know he had a double.
He was in that 15 range. 15.
Yeah. So I would love, if either of you have more insight than me, I would love to hear it. I was just kind of surprised to hear his name for that.
Yeah, well, I was extremely surprised by Avery because I hadn't really I had maybe seen his name twice this season. And of course, I remember him and know him from Paul VI, but I was surprised about that. I wasn't surprised about a Northern Virginia, having somebody represent Northern Virginia. But I didn't, I just didn't have any idea it would be him. My understanding is he had a good season, had an impactful season. I would never want to say a kid was not an All-Met, all conference or an all league type of player. I would just go on record as saying that I think that there were kids that I certainly would put before him.
Well, let me say this. I wasn't really shocked because I've been following the Post articles this season, and normally I see a pattern of when they highlight a player from especially an obscure player, they kind of find their way to an All-Met list, or that school or that program has a player find their way to an All-Met list. So for him, when he had that two-sport article written about him where he both played football and he played basketball, and he was a transfer coming from PVI, it didn't really shock me that he was actually the selection for the All-Met list. But I just want to go back for a second. He left PVI to play football, at another school, which is fine. But if he was at a higher level, football or basketball is lower.
I thought
if he was playing at PVI,
I thought basketball was secondary.
Right, but if he were at PVI which is a national program, he probably would not have ever had a chance to make this first team All-Met list. Right. So that's that. I mean, what kind of message are we sending with this selection? What kind of message is the Post sending with this type of selection? No, I mean, what type of message is the Post sending? And if any player in the area, and we'll talk about him right after this.
I think that they're rewarding him for what they think is his athleticism and versatility.
Yeah, but see, I can't agree with that because we're going to talk about Corey Dyches right after that. And we have a two-sport athlete.
Yeah, but Corey's the real thing, and that's the conversation we'll have later. But Corey,
right? But the thing with him is he's first team football, and now he's first team All-Met basketball as well. And he's probably the first person since Lawrence Moten to do that.
Second since Moten.
Okay. Well, he's certainly
Deontay.
Who else did it? Who else did it?
Okay, right.
Got it. Appreciate it. I wasn't sure. Thank you. But go ahead, Mr. Dickinson. You want to finish up?
That's what this is. But in the case of Corey, I mean, Corey didn't play. If we didn't know Corey played football, he still would have been in consideration for top 10 as a basketball player. Yep.
Got it. All right, so let's move on to Corey Dyches. Stern, you want to go first? I know did you have Corey on your bubble, or was he on your initial list?
I had one guy to pick from, and I had a couple of candidates, and I ended up going with him from that candidate. I think the final game of his season solidified his spot on the list. Now, again, this was a playoff game, and I don't know where you draw the list of which playoff games count and which playoff games don't count. I mean, Corey Dyches was right on my bubble. He scored 37 points on 8 threes against St. Charles in his last game. And I think for me and for the Post, that took him over the bubble. What happens if Trey Thomas scores 38 points in his next game? That game doesn't count, but Corey Dyches' game does count.
But I tell you what, Mark, you had a very strong argument for him in our first conversation. As you had him on your bubble, but you had very strong leanings, for having him in your top 10. No surprises there. He just ended up delivering, a great game against St. Charles. But at the end of the day, you wouldn't have had any problem with him squeezing in this top 10 if for example, if both of us, if G and I both said, "Hey, Corey Dyches," you didn't have any problem with that.
I agree, but both of us also talked about Max Brooks and Chesley on our first pod too, and neither of them made it, and they still have games to play, and one of them could score 37 in their last game against against an amazing defense or an amazing team in Poly. And then they wouldn't make it because that playoff game doesn't count, but it does.
Yeah.
But let's go back for a second. I'm not 100% sure that Saint game against St. Charles actually did it for Dyches. I think he had performances throughout the year, especially in conference, in which he had some really absurd points and rebounds. I mean, he really, really put in a lot of work on the basketball court this year in his performances. Plus, they were a post top 20 team as well at some point. And then on top of that, you throw in, like I mentioned before, the two-sport athlete. And in this particular area, especially for what he's done on the basketball side, he is probably the premier two-sport athlete. So I think that he would have made this list, even though he was on the bubble for me, because I did not believe that the Post would take 2 players from PG County. And I think I mentioned that in the last post. But his production definitely warranted him to have a consideration for first team, and he actually was rewarded with that. And got it. All right, so let's move on. We're staying in PG County. Let's move on to Ronald Polite. Both Mr. Dickerson and I had Ronald Polite. Well, I think all 3 of us had Ronald Polite, as first team All-Met. You just didn't have him as player of the year, Stern. Right. Did you want to talk about Ronald for a second?
Go ahead, dude.
For me, he was my player of the year. His body of work during the course of the season was, phenomenal. Really, this kid really balled out this year. Brought that program back to life because they really have been down for several years. So I was all in favor of him. Being not only a first teamer, but being POY, being a player of the year.
Got it. I picked him as POY as well for the Washington, D.C. area. And I know last time we talked about him winning a championship in PG County, you both said it didn't count. But to me, he beat a locally ranked team in order to do it. He also beat Potomac, which is in PG County as well, twice. And then both he and Corey fell to St. Charles in the playoffs, but I don't think that had any those performances and those losses had any dings against him being on this list. And Stern, did you want to chime in, or are you done with Polite?
I mean, he is an unbelievable talent. I've talked to a couple of people whose basketball opinions I really, really respect, and they said they would not be surprised if this kid ended up in the league one day. He's a phenomenal basketball player, phenomenal IQ. I think, Ronald Polite. I think anyone who didn't have Polite on their first team was living under a rock. I mean, this kid really kind of took the area by storm, especially for a kid that doesn't come from the league that represents most of the list. He was just tremendous. I mean, everything he does on the court. I've talked to a couple of people whose basketball opinions I really respect and who are not biased in this, and they say they can see Polite playing in the league one day.
I can see that as well. I would say right now he's trending towards that. He's that kind of he's already, got NBA athleticism, if you will.
Yeah, and I think that kind of the mind part is too. I mean, he's really, really smart. He knows what's about to happen. He knows how to draw fouls, to work refs. He just sees things a step or two steps ahead of everybody else.
Yeah, he's a really advanced player. I mean, he's indicated right now he'll be really successful at the at the next level, at the Division I level. So everything else, at that point is hard work, luck, and where you end up at.
Got it. So, sir, I just want to go back to something you just said. You have biased basketball conversations with people?
I'm just like, I don't want people to think this came from like Polite's coach. That was what I was saying. Like,
got it.
From people who don't like have a horse in the race, so to speak.
Got it. Got it. All right. Well, let's finish up the list. We have one last player, Xavier Lipson. Who wants to go first?
So go ahead, Dave.
No, I was gonna say G should go first on that. I've always like this kid. I did not have him on my list because not because he wasn't under consideration from me. I just didn't know, whether he would would make my top 10, but he certainly is. He certainly had a really good season, and he certainly is among any top 10 group, here. Now, whether he makes it, and of some of the kids that we've talked about, he's probably the least known. So, that's one of the reasons why he didn't make my list, but it was not because he wasn't good enough or didn't have a great senior campaign.
Got it. So for me, two things that really stick out about him. The first thing is the point production. I didn't think that a lot of people would necessarily have him in consideration when there are other kids who put up actual points, numbers as far as scoring points. That's the first thing. And then the other thing, I wasn't necessarily sure how the voters would react with him and his team actually losing games to the WCAC, Gonzaga, losing to DeMatha, and then also losing to PBI, three locally ranked teams and also nationally ranked teams. But then I kind of thought, well, do those games? I know those games count, but should they really count against him because he doesn't play in that conference? But at the same time, the Saints have elevated that program to where they're now, at least this year, they're a top 5 team. Last year, I think they finished maybe within the top 10 or whatever. So I don't know. I didn't know if the voters would hold that against him, losing those games. But as far as his overall season, they had a great season, only having losses to the WCAC and then one team outside of the DC area, which was also nationally ranked as well. So, Stern, did you want to go?
I think everything you just said was very insightful. I think, like Mr. Dickerson mentioned a minute ago, he wasn't like widely known throughout I guess common basketball. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people knew about him, but he wasn't one of these guys who was talked about like maybe some of the other guys we've talked about a couple of years ago. But I think he's really played himself into these conversations. I mean, this past summer, the defense that he played on Timberlake when St. Stephen St. Agnes beat them 3 straight games in a row. I mean, he's like proven himself against these guys, and he doesn't have those numbers, but he was probably the best player. If you were to poll 100 people, the vast majority would probably tell you he was the best player on St. Stephen St. Agnes. But on any given night, like we know, cross or screen could also be in the conversation for that. And that was the reason I didn't have him on my list, is because I don't think it's a slam dunk that he is the guy from St. Stephen St. Agnes. He probably is. And that might be one of the reasons why a St. Charles guy couldn't make it, because it's no slam dunk which one of those two it is. And I thought that more than anything was maybe what was going to keep him out, is that there were other candidates from his own team that were going to take away votes from him. But I guess they don't do it like that. It's not like a voting thing where if you have X amount of first place votes and your teammates' votes can keep you out. But yeah.
Right. But I think one thing that also helped him, though, was he won the Player of the Year in the conference, and they also won the championship, and they also went undefeated. So I think those things, remember we talked about previously, strength of schedule, winning, production, and impact. And I think he kind of checked the boxes on a few of those things, and I think that's how he actually made the list. Right. But I definitely don't think it was the point.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I agree. That was really good insight on him. I mean, I've loved watching him over the years. I mean, I didn't know who he was the first year he came to Summer League at, the Summer League I run at DeMatha, but, by the last year, he was first team all Summer League. I mean, he was one of the most impactful players in the entire Summer League. And I've really enjoyed watching his progression. And he has that tenacity and that dog in him that, not everybody has.
Got it. So let's move on, which we've kind of dibbled and dabbled in this already. Let's talk about the notable snubs. So we know we only had 10 people who could actually make the first team. Who do you think was the most notable snub from the first team on that list this year? Who do you have, Mr. Dickinson?
Well, I don't know. Can we actually put it in the category of being the most notable snub? How about we just say snub, at least for me? I just thought, because even with our group was when we were deciding on our 10, Leggett for me, Ishmael Leggett of St. John's was the guy that I thought had a monster senior year, and I know for a fact, particularly in the league, that in talking with coaches, he was the guy. He was the X factor that they were scheming for, and trying to keep him from causing too much damage. So it was Ishmael Leggett.
So I'm going to ask you.
Been in the top 10.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you, who are you taking off the list?
I'm not taking anybody off the list. I don't want to do that to a kid. But if I were going to do that to a kid, It would probably be, you know, our the Ford. Yeah.
Okay, so here's my question to you. You're taking off Avery Ford, but you now have 60% the first team all Met.
I don't care about that. You tasked me with my top 10 this year. And for my top 10, I needed about 15 or 16 spaces, 15, 16 guys that we could have, I think you can make an argument for that could have been top 10. And of course, it gets down to, you making a decision based on the kind of year that they had. And then for me too, as I've always said, it also has to do with me having, seen them, develop as players, as team leaders, as team captains, is taking on different roles with their teams, in this particular season. And so, and that's how I made my decisions. But, again, I don't want to take any light from any kid because, Avery would have been, maybe would have, if I had a top 20 list, he might have snuck on my top 20 list, but he was not, on my radar. But that doesn't mean anything because I do miss, I do miss some of the Northern Virginia public, school play. I'm not on top of that as I would have been, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. So that's what I don't want to take anybody off, but Ish to me had I thought had a great senior year and different role than he's ever been in his time at St. John's because there were different personnel and guys that are other places now and making, big dents in, in their Division I situations. And I think that, that's part of the growth of these kids. I mean, we talked a little earlier about Hunter and how Hunter really, we saw some things this year that we hadn't seen before, but you got to remember, every year your role changes. And particularly in a program like a DeMatha, so that's my thought on it.
Got it. So who did you have as the biggest snub, Stern?
This is going to sound weird, but I feel like one of the St. Charles kids should have made it, and I don't even know which one. And that's why I think we need to wait till the season plays out to see which one raises to the top. But I think for the year that team had, for neither of those two kids and their coach not to win Coach of the Year was just kind of an insult to SMAC basketball in general. And, I mean, those two kids in beating Polite handily, in beating Dickinson and Potomac, I mean, they proved that they are legitimate. They're not some team from the SMAC that's beaten up on a bunch of SMAC opponents. Like, they are a damn good basketball team. And I think one of those kids deserved. But it's tough. I don't know which one. I think that's the part where I would like to see the rest of the season play out. But they were a great team and they had an unbelievable 1-2 punch. They actually had a great 1-2-3 punch in Omar McCann. That kid. He's not as highly regarded as Chesley and Brooks. He's definitely a kid who should be mentioned.
Got it. And I just want to piggyback off you because I completely agree with you. I think that for one of the St. Charles kids not to make it, regardless of what they've done in the postseason, their overall regular season and only losing one game, and that's being to a locally ranked team, Middleburg as well. I think that those two players, either Max Brook or Tremaine Chesley, are the two most notable snubs from the All-Mat first team list. So one of them has to make it. And like you said also, especially if the Coach of the Year isn't picked from St. Charles as well. But I also have one other, and that was Darren Buchanan of Wilson.
Right.
I mean, here we are. We have a player of the year as a sophomore and one of the top 5 area conferences in our immediate area. I think we all can agree DCPS will be a top 5 conference in our area, right? Or am I on?
Well, this year.
Well, just let's say traditionally.
Well, traditionally, yes, but
yeah, I would say this year.
3 ranked teams this year, though. They did have 3 locally ranked teams this year. Coolidge, Wilson, and Roosevelt were ranked locally this year in the DCPS.
And then after that, there is a huge drop this season.
I mean, if you count PG 3A, 2A, 1A, and then PG 4A as 2 separate leagues, I mean, then I'm not sure if they'd be top 5.
Yeah, certainly not this year. It's just no, not this year.
All right. So, but for me, he was one of the more notable snubs as well. And, I'm looking at the overall list. He was the player of the year in the DCPS as a sophomore. Wilson was a locally ranked team. And, you mentioned this before, I think Avery Ford, he had a great year, but I mean, leaving PVI to play basketball, I know he went to play football first. Football became his primary, but to play in that particular public school, I'm not sure that conference is that strong in the DCPS right now.
Yeah, you might have an argument for that, but I think after those 3 schools, I think you have just a huge drop off.
Right, but Wilson's strength of schedule, I think, should take a play into that. His overall impact and also his production. Yeah. So I think he checked a lot of boxes. Plus, he won that actual award as a sophomore, a true sophomore as well. I think that should count for something. But did anyone else have any notable snubs, or are you ready to move on to Coach of the Year?
Notable snubs, not really. I talked originally about Darius Johnson, but he's not a notable snub. Of course, the kid at Episcopal. But he would be in my top list for kids who had great seasons.
Got it. Stern, you got anybody else?
No, I mean, I think Jao Atuka for me is the guy who, aside from the 2 St. Charles kids, who was on my bubble. I mean, he was on my team before they got upset in the playoffs. I don't think it's egregious, but he would be the guy who, I would have to really a hard look at, who he should replace.
So what about Cam Tweedy? I know you were following his production and his team success all season. What about Cam Tweedy? Did you at any point think that he might, despite not winning the SMAC, that he might have made this team?
I mean, I thought he was in the conversation at one point, depending on how certain things went. But his team finished 11-9, I think. I mean, he was definitely impactful, but I don't think he was a first team All-Met player for sure.
Yeah, I think a SMAC kid that makes, first team has to be super, super outstanding, and have gotten some, publicity over the course of the year, and I don't think he got a lot of that, and I think the lion's share of that went to the St. Charles program this year. So very difficult, just politically, I think, for that. Now, if he was averaging 50, but and I think again, that's almost what you have to do, or your program has to have a monster year, like they did at St. Charles.
Mm-hmm. St. Charles, right. So before we move on to Coach of the Year, I just want to know, do you guys have any kids who you predict will be first team All-Met next year? And not that didn't make this list, because I know we have some underclassmen on this list, but some other kids or players possibly who you think could be on there next year?
Jalatuka next year for sure will be on there.
Jalatuka, Buchanan, who you mentioned, that lit up everybody's radar this year.
Rodney Rice.
Yeah, and I don't know whether I've heard that he may not stay in place in terms of the school he's at currently. He would be right there because that kid can really score the ball.
So barring any transfers, Rodney Rice.
Well, yeah, and even if he does, I mean, he's if he transfers local, he's still he's still that kind of player.
I think Eric Reynolds from Bullis could be. I mean, obviously, if Rodney left, that would leave Eric in a better position. But I think he has the talent to be a first team All-Met.
Yeah, he's very good. He has an extra explosion that some players don't have. He's really good. Quincy. Judah Mintz for me.
Yeah,
Doug McDaniels.
Right. I think pretty close to exploding. We've seen some great flashes from him. I think Doug had a great year this year when you consider that, last year he was kind of a surprise to a lot of people. And this year, he was called on to do some other things. He was called on to be a defensive stopper. He was called on to be to be off the ball as well. So I think he did very well in from a role perspective because they weren't Ball 6 wasn't very big this year.
Right.
He's a potential first teamer next year for sure.
Amani Hansberry.
Yep.
St. John's.
Maybe the newcomer of the year or rookie of the year, if you will, in that conference. Turned up big a lot of games this year.
I also have Trey Thomas. He'll be back. I have Garrett Johnson from Episcopal, and I have the big from McNamara. I don't want to mispronounce his name.
Yeah.
Yes, I have him as well. So I think next year's team is going to be really, really strong as well. So let's move on to
Jordan Hawkins, the coach of the year. Another one who could.
Yeah.
His role will definitely increase next year. Yeah, Jordan Hawkins. So let's move on to coach of the year. Rob Nickens of Theodore Roosevelt in the district public school conference won. What are you guys' thoughts on that? I know last time we kind of said Rob likes to tell everybody that he's the best coach in the area, and he finally won it and proved that. So what do you guys have to say about that?
Go ahead.
I think every year there's multiple guys who are deserving for this award, and it's really tough to pick one guy. I'm fine with Rob Nickens. I mean, what he was able to do there with probably not the most talent he's ever had, maybe not even close to the most talent he's ever had. I mean, this kid loves basketball. I mean, not this kid. This guy loves basketball and loves coaching like to its core. I mean, this stuff means more to him than it probably means to most coaches. And I actually spoke to him briefly yesterday. He's really excited about this, and I'm.
Did you confirm if this was his first? Okay, got it. Go ahead.
He was. If I had 2 or 3 votes, he definitely. I don't know who my number one vote would be. I really don't. But if I had 2 votes, he would definitely have gotten one of them. But it's just so hard to give out one guy when there's a guy like at St. Charles who is right there with him, had 1 loss. And then for me, I had Mike Jones from St. Stephen St. Agnes, and that was kind of based on what he had done last year and the culture he's brought to that program. But it's really difficult to pick one guy, but I'm totally fine with Rob Nickens being that guy.
Has there ever been co-coaches of the year? I know the WCAC has done that before, I believe, right? But what about for the Post? Has there ever been?
I don't think so. I know there's never been co-players of the year for the Post. But I'm not 100% sure on co-coaches. But I would assume if there's never been for players, that there probably wouldn't be for coaches.
Probably not. Got it. And did you want to chime in on Rob Nickens?
I mean,
Mr. Dickerson?
he's certainly, deserving. It's a bit of a culmination for him too, because he has been a good coach for a long time, and tremendous results this year. As we talked on the first show, my choice was not Mike Jones of Stephen St. Agnes, but Mike Jones of DeMatha, and I know he's, would be considered a usual suspect. But I just thought, based on where they were this summer, and then where they were at the beginning of the year and where they ended up, that Mike just put in a tremendous year, tremendous coaching job. I saw some things from him that I had not seen before, and I mentioned them before. I've never seen Mike play this many guys.
Right.
And and that obviously, the program like DeMatha, we have to shuffle and you make in-game decisions. I just thought he did a tremendous job between the beginning of the year and then where this team ended up and the performances he got out of these kids. So he was my first choice, but I had several guys that I thought could have been there as well. I talked I think a little bit before about Lewis Howard out at Oxon Hill, who has been a good coach for a long time. He was at Largo, and he kind of struggled a little bit and with Ron Polite's performance, did a great job, I think, at Oxon Hill. You have the job that was done over at it was done at St.CHARLES this year. Coolidge, for that matter. Great coaching done there this year. So there are a lot of people that we could have probably put in that mix. It's funny because when you look at the coach of the year over the years from the Washington Post, a lot of times it was coaches that you didn't expect to win, so again, it's about that award seems to really be about a one season performance, So anyway, I mean, with Rob getting it, he certainly deserves it and certainly did a great job. I'm not, I wouldn't take anything away from him. He's managed a lot of. The past couple of years, guys that would have been in his program, he's managed a lot of comings and goings, and that takes a lot from a coaching perspective as well to be able to handle that. Literally getting almost like a junior college job, where you get a bunch of new kids every year and you got to make the puzzle pieces fit. So.
I think this is the second time in 3 years the DCI AA coaches won it, right? Didn't
Hernandez get it last year?
Hernandez won it, no, 2 years ago. Last year was Steve Turner, right?
Yeah, Steve Turner last year.
Yeah, so.
Yeah, I had actually picked Coach Nickens as the coach of the year for the Washington Post, and I pretty much was, I gave my whole spiel on that time, so I won't go into it again. But congratulations to him and to his
Absolutely.
program for everything they accomplished this year. Yeah. So let's take a quick. We're going to go into the Player of the Year, and that was the Washington Post Player of the Year, which was Hunter Dickinson. And who wants to go first on speaking on him as the Player of the Year?
I was fine with Hunter getting it. I mean, I had Earl as my guy. I thought it really could have gone either way. The only thing I was a little unsure of was would a DeMatha guy win it 2 years in a row? I don't remember the last time that a different player from the same school has won it 2 years in a row, and I thought that maybe that was kind of one of those unwritten rules that they had, that like a Northern Virginia public has to make it. Like the coach usually doesn't get named it twice over his career unless it's 20, 30 years apart. And I thought the no DeMatha. So maybe I was a bit surprised if it wasn't Hunter or Earl. I guess it would have been Roach or Polite. But I thought Hunter was deserving. I mean, he was probably the best player on the best team, and I was totally fine with Hunter winning the award.
All right. So for me, and I put an asterisk beside Earl's name earlier in the podcast when we were talking about him being first team all Met. So for me, Hunter had a great season. DeMatha had a great season. Like you said, they probably were the most dominant team in the Washington, D.C. area this year. My only concern with him winning Player of the Year is he has another first team all Met player on his team. And not only that, when we talk about Earl, we kind of place a question mark beside Hunter's name every time we talk about DeMatha. Every time we talk about Hunter, we always say Hunter may be the most outstanding player, but Earl may be the most valuable. He's the most versatile. He's probably the best defender. You had him as your actual Player of the Year. So my concern is we awarded both of them as first team all Mets, but now we're awarding one of them as Player of the Year, and he has not only another first team all Met, but a 5-star player on his team as well. So that's why I kind of put that asterisk beside him. He's a great
why
team.
Why should that be held against him though?
Because to me, what other one or who has that type of who also was first team has another talent like that with him?
I agree with you on that front, but why should he not?
Yeah, why
should LeBron not be able to get MVP because Anthony Davis is his teammate?
Some people make that argument.
I'm not one of those people.
Some people make that argument. Well, let's talk about on the high school level. Very rarely do you have one 5-star. You have 2 5-stars, and then you've awarded them both as first team all Met. Now you're going to elevate another one and say he's Player of the Year.
I'm fine with that. Should Cade Cunningham not win National Player of the Year because he has 2 other McDonald's kids on his teams? I mean,
to me, absolutely he should.
I don't understand why that's against him.
Well, again, that goes to that goes to being spoiled, man. We're nowhere.
We're talking about Cade.
Yeah, that goes to being spoiled. I mean, it's not not Hunter or Earl's fault that they play in the same program.
Right, but the coach at Mount Bird is spoiled. He has, I think they said 9 Division I players, 9 ESPN top 100.
Because that's a national recruiting scenario.
Right. So let's bring it back locally where we say Hunter he's a 5-star. He has Earl as a 5-star. What other team has that in the area? And then that's just Earl and Hunter. We're not discrediting. We have Hawkins coming back next year for first team, and then we can't leave out Paul Smith, who's a Division I player. We can't leave out Terrell Ward, who's trending probably to be a Division I player. So it's not like Hunter carried the bulk of this load. Not to discredit his season, but we're talking about elevating him as a teammate.
What first team did Hawkins make?
No, we have him coming back next year being first team.
Okay.
Well,
that's what we just spoke
about potentially who could make it.
I mean, Paul Smith didn't even really play much this year.
Yeah, but he's a Division I level talent. Most teams don't have the talent that DeMatha has. So now we're rewarding them for first team All Met. I don't dispute that. But now we're elevating him as player of the year, and he's playing with another 5-star and at least 4 or 5 other Division I level talents.
But what is that?
Yeah, but I don't understand.
What do they have to do with each other?
They don't have anything to do with each other.
Because what other kid has the luxury of having that?
But those questions don't have anything to do with each other.
They do, because we have a list of 10 candidates who possibly could be player of the year. And for me, Ronald Polite was my player of the year. He was Mr. Dickinson's player of the year. He had winning, he had production, and he had impact. And his impact, you take him off that Oxon Hill team, right? Where are they? You take Hunter off of that DeMatha team, where are they?
If you take all these guys off their teams are going to be a lot worse. If you take Jamel Melvin off Potomac, instead of being 14-14, they're going to be 2-26. I mean, that's just
right.
That's just the nature of the beast of really good players.
Yeah.
Right, but my point is, if we didn't have 2 teammates from the same team, I wouldn't have an issue with that, who both made first team.
Yeah,
but now you're elevating one now to say he's player of the year when he clearly had help. And the Washington Post felt he had help as well. And you felt he had help because he could have been your player of the year. He could have been your player of the year.
I do think he had help. I just don't see what that has to do with he should be player of the year.
I don't see what it has to do with each other. I mean, our work here had to do with with really kind of trying to come up with 10 kids that essentially had the culmination of the best season, best performances. Most impact.
Did he have the best? Did he have the best? Did he have the best season?
Well,
this year?
I think that he, we all agreed that he had a stronger second half of the season, and he certainly. I remember my pick was Ron Polite, but guess what? I'm not mad at. I wouldn't have been mad if Earl Timberlake got it. I wouldn't be mad at Hunter for getting it. I wouldn't have been mad at Trevor Keels. All these guys are in the conversation.
No, I understand what you're saying, but I think those are the question marks that we place beside this Washington Post player of the year when we say, I wouldn't be mad. This player possibly could have done it. This player possibly, but the only thing that really bothers me about it is when you say another.
Yeah, teammate. Well, it's I don't.
Now Earl was honorable mention for Naismith also.
Yeah,
he and Jeremy.
Right. Well, and if you look at that list, because I went down and I did those Naismith and Hawks. Co-sponsored games. I went out and did the television on those, and if you look at that list, that Naismith list, it is extremely Georgia heavy, and that's because those Georgia teams all played in those tournaments that I called. We didn't have. I don't even think we had a representative this year to play in the Naismith series of high school tournaments that they sponsor. So just.
Do you believe he will? Do you believe that Hunter will be the Gatorade Player of the Year in the state of Maryland?
Could be him or Earl.
See, that's the question mark.
Yeah, him or Earl.
That's the question mark.
But again, those decisions are probably not going to be made with as much care and concern as we've given to just picking our top 10. It's probably going to be who's the most known, who's the most, it's going to be who's the most known of the sort of national scouts and people that they refer to. That's who it's going to be. They're not going to pull up the stats on 5 or 6 kids. Not going to do that.
No, I got you. I get what you're saying, but I think those question marks, and here's just the last thing I'm going to say about that. I want to make sure everyone understands perfectly fine with him being player of the year, but I do want to question it. And one of the things that came out in the last podcast from both of you, you both said Earl played extremely well in the first half. Hunter played extremely well in the second half. They both make All-Met first team, and now one is being elevated to player of the year. When we talk about Ronald Polite, we talk about Ronald Polite not in the second half of the season, not in the first. We talk about his entire season and what his impact was to Oxon Hill, what his production was for Oxon Hill. That's just me questioning this actual Washington Post player of the year. But congrats
to question that. But again, it's going to be about the most known players. And those most known players come from a combination of things. They come from a combination of, over the 4 years, what they did over in the DeMatha Summer League, what they did out on the circuit. That's how these players are known in reputations. Did they get an invite to USA, camp? And these are all things that, like both Hunter and Earl and Trevor and Jeremy got. However, Polite didn't get that, and so they're not as he's not as known an entity as known as a player, or even from recruiting perspective. So I think that has a lot. And it doesn't take anything away from these kids as individual players. And I think that you're I hear what you're saying, but you're asking for the post to all of a sudden be the be all and all. Do the most research and follow this thing as closely as you do, and they do not. So.
Right, but I just, this is the last thing I'm going to say, and then we're going to close out. Some of the things that you mentioned just then shouldn't have any bearing on what happens locally.
But it does.
So you mentioned Summer League, recruiting, USA basketball.
That's how we know a lot of these kids. This is how we know what they can do and how they can perform. We know them from that,
But that's, to me, some of these kids will never break through that. And you can, like you said, for somebody, you have to average almost 50 to make first team. When another kid could just play on the circuit and come.
That's where we have evolved into. When I first started with this thing, AAU was not the end all be all, or grassroots wasn't the end all be all. And I can make an argument for the fact that, some years ago now, it flipped where, grassroots and circuit play is the deciding factor for where you're recruited and where you go to school. Not high school. And it used to be the other way around. You could find, Marc, you can attest to this. You could find a gym or two or three in Montgomery County that was not known outside of Montgomery County and have a kid be a really great college player. The same would be true of Northern Virginia, DC and the BCAC kind of always kind of took care of themselves in terms of that, the recognition piece. But that's not how it is anymore. And you make a good point about breaking through. But this is where we are today. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying this is where we are.
I got you. So before we close out, Stern, you went a little quiet. I got a question for you. You have the deciding vote. Deciding vote for Player of the Year in the Washington D.C. area comes down between Hunter, comes down between Earl Timberlake. Who do you vote for? Be honest in your response. Who do you vote for?
You want my honest response? I wait till Alhambra's finished, because I think they're so neck and neck. If one of them had a real big performance over the other one, that could be the deciding factor.
But let's just say the season's over right now. Alhambra is let's say Alhambra is canceled because of the coronavirus. Who are you picking?
Which is probably which might be a possibility. But go ahead. We're joking about it, but everything else is pretty serious. But go ahead.
Oh man, I guess I would go with Hunter. I know I went with Earl the other day. I think the post in the past, when it's two guys 50-50 and one guy wins WCAC, sometimes they err on the side of giving it to the other guy for that award. Like the other guy picked up a really big award, and now they want to give someone else the other award. I mean, Hunter's.
Yeah, we saw it with Anthony Counts a few years back.
I mean, I think. Look, so we say that Earl had a great first half and Hunter had a great second half. If you really break it down, I think it was more like Earl had a great first third and Hunter had a great final 2/3, and then Earl had a better championship game. So if you really want to break it down more, I would say Hunter had a better portion of the season than Earl had. Now there were certain crossover games, like there were certain games in the latter 2/3 that Earl played better than Hunter, but from like a whole perspective, this is such a hard one. I don't know the right answer. If you put a gun to my head, I guess I would say Hunter, but I don't think DeMatha is as good. If you were to take each guy off the team, I think they need Earl more. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he's All-Met Player of the Year.
Stern, if we put a gun to your head, you would live because you flip-flop. You went straight up. You went straight up.
Wow.
I don't know. I mean, so something that I said, if there was ever a year to have co-players of the year, I think this would be it, because you have two teammates who are so deserving.
Right.
That's what I mean. I've been saying that for a couple of weeks. I mean, I don't know what the criteria to have co-players of the year is, but if there was ever a year, it would be this year.
Yeah, well, Polite was my guy, but if you were picking between those two, that's a really, really hard choice. Obviously, I probably would give it to, I give the nod to Earl. That's not taking anything away from Hunter's season. They both come a long, long ways as players and developing as young men. But I think that Earl's trajectory was a little higher, and I would give him the nod. I mean, he's come the furthest. He's taken on a lot of responsibilities. In terms of his role on the team, I think he had to be different things, and I would have to give it to Earl, and give Earl the nod. But again,
I'll also say this: if I really did have to make a decision, if it came down to me, I would sit down and do a lot more homework than what I've based my.
You do a lot more homework than the gun that G's got at your temple right now.